Well, today we've come to a topic that I can almost guarantee is going to challenge your thinking, and it may even ruffle some of your feathers, but I think it's extremely important that we give consideration to this particular perspective of American history, especially as American citizens. One fact seldom considered is that it's impossible to understand American history apart from an understanding of the streams of classical literature and thought that fed into it. In many ways, the United States of America is the culmination of 2,000 years of classical thinking. Actually, two competing streams of thought migrated to America with the original colonists. First was the Rosicrucian philosophy that had infiltrated the court of Queen Elizabeth I with John Dee and Francis Bacon and was incipient among the Jamestown colonists. It was later popularized by Benjamin Franklin. Second was the Puritan biblical perspective of the Massachusetts Pilgrims and Puritans. Now, Rosicrucianism, you may recall, disguises its occult or hidden mystery religion philosophy under the cloak of Christian terminology. The rose, being a symbol of secrecy, is superimposed on the cross. Now, we're going to do something a little bit different here, a little unusual from our past habit, and start out with a pop quiz as a pretest to establish your understanding of the meaning of American history before we get into the lesson. Again, only 5 questions, true or false. Question 1, Patrick Henry was one of the strongest supporters of the U.S. Constitution, true or false? Number 2, the Founding Fathers used the Bible as their great political textbook, true or false? Number 3, the U.S. Constitution is a Christian document, true or false? Number 4, George Washington was the first president of the United States, true or false? And number 5, George Washington was a born-again Christian. Now, one of the things revealed by a quiz like this is that many Americans, including American Christians, suffer from a peculiar form of historical myopia. They have an acute inability to perceive the meaning of their own past. Now, to be sure, many can recite a few of the salient high points from memory. They may know that the Pilgrims landed on Plymouth Rock. They may know that George Washington crossed the Delaware. They may even recognize James Madison as the father of the Constitution. But even where a remnant of historical recall remains, how many can really connect the dots? How many have constructed a mental framework on which to hang the particulars of historical fact? How many, like the children of Issachar, have understanding of the times to know what Israel ought to do? And sadly, it's very few. No wonder history is considered so dull by so many. In the minds of many, history rivals the economics for the title of the dismal science. Now, we would expect this of a non-believer, but even among Christians, historical acumen is mysteriously lacking. Misconceptions about American history are pervasive among both Christian and non-Christian Americans. For example, leading Christian writers on American history have failed to distinguish between the biblical civil covenant and the secular social contract, thereby missing the meaning of American history completely. The blame for this condition may in part be laid at the feet of the public school system, which has lamentably all but ignored the teaching of history. If we don't know where we've been as a people, we have no means of knowing where we are or where we're going. But there's something even deeper that plagues us, and that is the idolatry of statism. Unbelievers worship an all-encompassing state, beseeching government to provide for all their needs in the here and now. For them, the past is irrelevant. Christians react and call for a return to the original intent of the U.S. Constitution, failing to recognize that this, too, is a form of idolatrous statism that ignores the Bible. So we need to dig deeper than the original intent of the U.S. Constitution to get at the answers to our quiz. It all starts with the way we perceive the founding of America. Now, to help you assess your own perceptions, let's take a quick look at your quiz scores on each of these 5 questions. First of all, number 1, Patrick Henry was one of the strongest supporters of the U.S. Constitution. Well, as a matter of fact, Patrick Henry refused his invitation to attend the Constitutional Convention in the summer of 1787, declaring later, "I smelled a rat." Henry fought almost single-handedly and strenuously against ratification for 21 days in the Virginia Ratifying Convention. He argued that the Constitution was destructive of states' rights. It would lead to the ultimate enslavement of the American people. Henry prophesied the emergence of judicial tyranny in the Supreme Court, an oppressive dual level of taxation, and a suicidal treaty clause. He also prophesied a bloody civil war within 100 years if the Constitution were ratified. In debate, he opposed the Constitution on the grounds that it was a revolution, this is a quote, a revolution more radical than that which separated us from Great Britain, end of quote. So the answer to this question is false. Now, question 2, the Founding Fathers used the Bible as their great political textbook, true or false? Well, that's what many Christian history experts are claiming these days, but there's no substantive references to the Bible in the 4-volume set of notes taken at the Constitutional Convention. And on the other hand, there are at least 30 references to the governments of pagan Greece and Rome in the Federalist Papers, which were originally newspaper editorials written in defense of the Constitution. At the same time, there's no references to the Bible in the Federalist Papers. And last but certainly not least, there is no reference to God or the Bible in the body of the Constitution itself. So if the founders were using the Bible as a great political textbook, it's one of history's best-kept secrets. There were no public opinion polls at the time of the ratification debates. However, evidence suggests that Christians were, in fact, equally divided in their support for the proposed Constitution. So the answer to this question is false. Now, question 3, the U.S. Constitution is a Christian document, true or false? Although the Constitution contains some structural elements that may be found in the Bible, like Republican form, division of power, federal hierarchy, it is democratic and anti-biblical at the core. Aside from the date, there is no reference to God in the document whatsoever. In fact, the Constitution substitutes the authority of we the people for the covenant authority of God, which lay at the heart of the earlier state constitutions. Democracy is based on the will of the people, as opposed to the will or the word of God. Moreover, in Article 6, Section 3 of the Constitution, it forbids a religious test oath. That is, the requirement that an officeholder swear allegiance to God or the Bible, like most of the colonial constitutions and the Mayflower Compact. That requirement is a defining characteristic of a Christian government. In verses like Exodus 24:7, Joshua 24:24, 2 Kings 23:3, Jonah 3:6-9. So here again the answer is false. Now, number 4, George Washington was the first president of the United States, true or false? Well, contrary to popular opinion, the first president of the United States was John Hanson, under the Articles of Confederation. Ignorance of this period prior to the Constitutional Convention indicates the extent to which Americans have been subtly led to replace biblical government in their thinking with what has come to be known as the American civil religion. The American framers harkened back to the Roman orator Cicero in locating the locus of authority for their constitution in we the people. In so doing, they ignored and rejected the authority of God with whom earlier American documents had covenanted. The American civil religion evolved from this unbiblical base of authority. Its mythos includes George Washington as the great national deliverer, Thomas Jefferson as the great lawgiver, and Abraham Lincoln as the latter-day prophet of the Gettysburg Address, calling the nation back to its neglected roots in the Declaration. So the answer to this question is also false. And then question 5, George Washington was a born-again Christian, true or false? Well, not according to his pastor during the final years of his life, Dr. James Abercrombie of Christ Church in Philadelphia. Washington habitually refused to take communion, the biblical sign of covenant renewal. He always rose and walked out the back door on Communion Sunday. Quote, that Washington was a professed Christian, declared Dr. Abercrombie, is evident from his regular attendance in our church. But, sir, I cannot consider any man as a real Christian who uniformly disregards an ordinance so solemnly enjoined by the divine author of our holy religion and considered as a channel of divine grace, end of quote. So, while it's impossible to judge with certainty the condition of a man's heart, the available evidence strongly indicates that the answer is false. Well, for more information, if you got less than a perfect score, there's a pair of books I have written especially for you, and I believe you owe it to yourself to get the other side of the Constitution story that's so prevalent today, and these books give it to you. The first is entitled Discipling the Nations. And a quote, Woods has done us all a great service by writing this balanced, comprehensive, and intensely practical handbook to the subject of civil government. It's marked by biblical fidelity, sagacity, and cultural immediacy, according to George Grant, author and Christian historian. This book provides a unique analysis of the U.S. Constitution from a biblical vantage point. You get a sober look at some of the history behind the Constitution, revisiting the predominantly Christian anti-federalist objections raised when this important document was drafted. On top of that is a much-needed critique of its critical weaknesses as well as its strengths. I argue that the Constitution neglected to acknowledge a power higher than itself, thereby tacitly rejecting any divine absolutes. Thus, America's social problems are rooted not primarily in our departure from the Constitution per se, but in the humanism inherent within the very heart of the Constitution itself. The Constitution makes itself, not the Bible, the supreme law of the land. Now, the companion to Discipling the Nations is Covenant and Crisis in American History. This manual is designed to supply the mystic ingredient, the key that unlocks the mystery of American history. Virtually all our misconceptions of the past may be traced to a failure to grasp one fundamental law of history. It is a theological principle that finds expression in historical law. What is that law? It is very simply the idea that God operates by covenant in history, blessing obedient to the terms of his covenant and cursing disobedience. Deuteronomy 28. A nation covenants with God by means of the oath of its leaders, that the oath of its leaders swear to govern in accordance with the law of God. Jonah 3, 6-9. This book traces that fundamental law through 6 eras of American history. The response of the American people to the terms of God's covenant is best apprehended in the literature produced in each era. The throbbing heartbeat of history may be felt in its poetry and prose. You'll discover the pulse of America coursing through the pages of this book. Well, now that we've invested some time looking at the content of a classical Christian education, let's return briefly to the beginning, to the study of grammar, specifically Latin. And we skipped over it earlier because we thought you might be frightened away by the idea of learning a dead language. But I think you're ready now for our next lesson, which we'll get to tomorrow, Lord willing.